Hello and welcome back. This is Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Today I have another comparison video for you. We will be taking a look at the M1 Garand or M1 Garand, the M9130 Mosin Nagant, the K98 Mauser is used by the Germans in the Second World War, and the number 4 Mark I Lee-Enfield SMLE. In this video we are going to be doing a tabletop review and comparison, looking at some of the different characteristics of each. Also, this will serve as sort of a field guide when you're looking into collecting or getting into the surplus market, kind of seeing where prices have evolved and what you can get into for different price ranges. Anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, stick around. That's coming up right now. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into these and go over the general specifications of each. Starting up here with the M1, it was in service from 1936 to 1959, most generally used through World War II and the Korean War conflict. There were a total of 6.25 million produced. So there were a handful of manufacturers that were contracted to manufacture the M1s during their service period. During World War II, we most commonly saw them made by Springfield and Winchester. During the Korean War conflict, they were also made by International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson, or HRA or HNR, however you want to go by that. This particular one is a 1955 example used in the Korean War and made by HRA. Moving down to the Mosin, they were used in service starting in 1891, hence the name 9130. To current day, they are being used in current conflicts today. There are a total of 37 million produced. These are made by the Ivzhevsk Arsenal, Tula, I think one or two others that I'm not remembering right now, but those were mainly the two that you saw them made by Ivzhevsk and Tula, the two major arms manufacturers for Russia, at least during the time. Coming down to the K98 Mauser, this is the German K98K variant used in the Second World War. They were produced between 1935 and 1945 at the end of the war. These were made by many different manufacturers, too many for me to name off. Most notably Mauser made them amongst many others. During the time, Germany used manufacturing codes to code the rifle. This one is code 237. Not too familiar who the manufacturer designation for that would be, and it was made in 1939. The reason that they use obscure production codes or manufacturer codes is to throw off the Allies. If any of these were captured, they didn't want to give away who was making what small arms in order to save them from essentially being bombed or put out of service during the war. This is a number 4 Mark I Lee-Enfield or SMLE short magazine Lee-Enfield, manufactured between 1904 to present. Now the earlier variations were the number 1 Mark III, which I do have here. So some changes were made. You could go over those changes in a whole other video, but this is the variation that would have been used during the Second World War, at least by Britain. Now Lithgow Arms Manufacturing Company, which actually this one is made by Lithgow or Lithgow, is an Australian company. Now during the Second World War, Lithgow did produce these. They stayed with the number 1 Mark III model, as they didn't see any need to change and retool for the number 4 that usually the Canadians and the British had changed to. This particular example here, this number 1 Mark III, is a 1941 production, so it would have been used by the Australians during the Second World War. Like I said, the SMLE was made 1904 to present. There were a total of 17 million produced. And they're currently being used today in some conflicts. Now this particular model was made in 1949 and it was used by the South Africans. As denoted by a crest here, it's a U with an upside down arrow inside the U. If you want to check that out on Google, or maybe I'll roll in an image of what that looks like up close. This would be a South African variant, but it is identical to the Enfields that were used by the British in World War II. And this particular one was made by Fazarkli or Fazarkli, however you want to pronounce it. Getting back up here into the M1 Garand, or it's technically pronounced Garand, but I'm going to say Garand. The total weight on this is 9.5 pounds, and it's a total length of 43.5 inches, and it is chambered in 30-06. It was fed by an internal load 8-round in-block clip, which would be inserted into the top of the rifle. You would have 8 rounds of 30-06. When your last round was spent, the in-block clip would fly out the top, making that iconic pinging noise that everybody's familiar with. So you had an 8-round semi-automatic, gas-operated, shoulder-fired rifle. which was at the time quite a innovation, not the standard issue style for most other countries. Now it's true the Germans did have the G41 and the G43 semi-automatic rifles, but they were not standard issue to every particular infantryman. They were made in limited production. They actually are pretty rare today, but for most of the war, the German infantryman was issued the K98 Mauser, which we'll get to in a minute. The Mosin Nagant 9130 is 8.8 pounds and has a total length of 48.5 inches, so it is very long. It is a bolt action, so single shot bolt operated rifle with a fixed 5-round magazine. You would feed each round through the top or use a 5-round stripper clip to load the rifle. Moving down to the K98, it does have a weight of 8.5 pounds and an overall length of 43.7 inches. It is also a bolt action rifle and is fed in an internal, it does have an internal magazine which is fed through the top either with individual rounds or with a stripper clip up to 5 rounds, and again the box magazine is internal and it is fixed. It is of course actuated by use of the bolt here. The number 4 Enfield is 9.06 pounds and has a total length of 44.45 inches. It is fed through it is a detachable box magazine, but the magazine would stay fixed, and it would be loaded through the top traditionally with single rounds or on stripper clips. The advantage of the Enfield over the K98 Mauser and the Mosin Nagant is it did hold 10 rounds. So it did have double the capacity. Of course, reloads would be a little bit slower because you'd have to feed in 2 stripper clips as opposed to 1. The M1 Garand, as we mentioned, is chambered in 30-06. The Mosin Nagant is chambered in 7.62 by 54R, R meaning rimmed. The K98 Mauser is chambered in 8mm Mauser. And the Lee-Enfield is chambered in 303. As we have discussed, the M1 is semi-automatic, and the other 3 are bolt action. Now, another advantage that the Enfield did have compared to the other 2, and it's a little bit of a design difference. So the Mosin Nagant and the K98 Mauser are cock-on open, so that means if the rifle is fired and I want to basically cycle the bolt, so that initial bolt opening is going to be a little stiff because what I'm doing is I'm not only opening the bolt or turning the bolt open or unlocking the bolt, but I'm also cocking the firing pin. So now I'm cocking it on open, which makes it a little bit stiff, a little bit more difficult. Then I can pull to the rear, cycle the rifle, and then close, and it's ready to fire. The K98 Mauser works the exact same way, so if it's fired, it's going to be that a little bit tougher to pull open, cocking or arming the firearm, then cycling, then going into battery, and then it can fire. One difference of the Lee-Enfield is it is cock on close. So what happens is when I open it, it's actually nice and easy to open, pulls to the rear, and then closes as I'm pushing it forward. So I do have that rearward or that forward momentum going forward into battery, and then now it's cocked. With the striker already armed, you do see that spring tension. If I go ahead and just push the bolt open, you'll see it kind of spring to the rear. But anyway, it's not going to do that if the bolt is down. If I want to decock any of these, I can go ahead and as I'm pushing forward, I can just pull the trigger and then push in and it decocks the rifle. The same is going to be true of the Mauser. If I want to disarm it, I can just pull the trigger and drop it, and it drops my drops my striker down for me. Let's get into the sights now. The M1 Garand has a rear peep sight aperture, which is windage adjustable and elevation adjustable by using these knobs. On the left-hand side, I can twist this knob to raise my elevation, and on the right-hand side, I can turn it to change my windage, left or right. On the front, I do have a fixed post, which is protected by these 2 ears. The Mosin Nagant has a rear V-notch sight, so there is a notch here with a fixed front post on the front, which does have this nice sight hood on it. The rear sight is windage adjustable by pushing in these tabs and moving it up and down to change your elevation, very similar to what we see on an AK-47 today. For windage adjustments, the front sight would have to be tapped either left or right to make small windage adjustments. So the K98 is very similar to the Mosin Nagant, as it is elevation adjustable in the rear, very much the same way, and it does have a V-notch and a front sight post. So by sliding this, I can change my elevation in meters. The front sight is windage adjustable. The front sight base is dovetailed in, so it would have to be tapped left or right to make those windage changes. The Lee-Enfield does use an Aperture rear sight. There is a larger aperture here, or I can flip this graduated ladder rear sight up, and it gives me a smaller aperture here if I'm looking through here for that kind of better and more precise accuracy. If I want to change my elevation, I will use this dial up on the top to rotate that to start raising my aperture base here, changing my elevation. The front sight is a fixed post, which is windage adjustable. It is dovetailed into the front sight base. There are these two open holes in the protecting ears, the front sight protection ears, which I can stick a punch through and then tap either way to change my windage. These are four of some of the most common and most desirable milsurp rifles from World War II. As we mentioned, we don't have an Italian Carcano or an Arisaka Type 38 or Type 99 on the table, as I do not have them here at my disposal. But these basically represent a huge chunk of what people like to collect when it comes to World War II small arms collecting in the rifle families. The prices and what you should look for are vary drastically, and they're always changing. If we went back even 4 or 5 years ago, the prices on these things were a lot cheaper. They've just skyrocketed over the past several years. There could be lots of reasons for those. I'm not going to speculate on what those are, but you probably all have your own ideas of, why some of the pricing on this stuff has gone up. For example, a lot of the M1 Garands are reconditioned, rebarreled, and refurbished for use in the Korean War and after. These you can find with importation marks if they came back from Greece or wherever they were basically used or leased to after the Korean War. If those came back into the country, those are going to be import marked, which is going to hurt the value. This particular one does not have an importation mark. The Korean War era M1s or the World War II era M1s that have been reconditioned for the war typically would be the cheapest, and you used to be able to get those for $600, $700, $800. But even things like this HRA, and this is an aftermarket Boyd's stock on here. Even these are going for up over $1,000, is where they're starting. So the pricing on them has gone up. I don't know if we're going to see them come down anytime in the future. They are still excellent pieces of history. And I do have some customers who have talked to me about getting the new production Springfield M1s. I would not recommend getting those because you can still get these for as cheaper or about the same amount of money, and they do have a lot more history. If you have not fired an M1, I would definitely recommend picking one up, but now they're just, unfortunately, the cheap M1 or the days of the cheap M1 Garands is kind of behind us. So expect to spend about $1,000, maybe a little bit less if you're lucky, for just a shooter grade. Now, if you're getting a World War II era Springfield or Winchester, all correct grade, excellent condition and collectible, no importation marks, maybe early lock bar sights, expect to spend $2 to $3 grand for something like that. Mosin Nagants are probably the most common that you're going to find in people's collections, even if they don't collect necessarily milsurp rifles. They were at one time very cheap, $70 to $100 even 5 years ago. Now the pricing on them has just creeped up to $200 to even $300. I've seen even for the hex receivers, people asking $350, $400 for them and getting that money. I mean, I've seen some crazy stuff with this surplus stuff. Still, I mean, if we're looking at it now, if we're looking at like kind of what I call off-brand surplus, so rifles that are definitely surplus from the World War II era or 1950s, but weren't necessarily used in any notable conflicts or conflicts of interest, like the Yugoslavian Mausers, Swedish Mausers, things like that. Let's just take Yugoslavian Mausers, for example. You can get those now for about the same price as a Mosin, and a Yugo Mauser is still a Mauser, and it's still a very robust and excellent action. But just the pricing on this stuff is crazy. Maybe we'll see it come down. But like I said, today, and what you're going to find is all import marked, as they all came over in the 90s and early 2000s. You're going to find all of them are going to be import marked, refinished, refurbed, most of the time not matching. And like I said, you're going to expect to pay about $200 to $300 for one now. Still a good value though. I mean, they are excellent rifles. They are a ton of fun to shoot, and they do carry that collectible history. If you watched Enemy at the Gates, you probably would be interested in having one of these in your collection just for the novelty of that movie, and that's another reason a lot of these started selling. I guess that movie came back out in the mid-90s, so that's kind of when these started getting popular. Ammunition for them has kind of dried up a little bit. You used to be able to get a spam can of 7.62 by 54R, maybe 440 rounds you could get for $80. Now you're lucky to find the same amount of ammunition for like 150 if you can find it. So all the big surplus ammo dealers like AIM and J&G and all that have just been dried out of it for a while. But hopefully we'll see that start to come back. K98 Mausers is another interesting facet in kind of the surplus collecting world. You basically have three different classifications when you're looking at an original German K98 from the war. Now, after World War II, what typically would happen is most, well, I should say half of technically of Germany was captured by the Russians and the other half by the British and the Americans. I'm being a little bit simplified there, but you get the idea. When the Germans were captured by the Russians, the first thing that was done, I guess this is true of Germans captured by Americans too, is the rifles were typically disbanded and taken apart, and parts were thrown into different piles. So you would have stocks over there, and then they would have, take out the bolt and throw it in this other pile, and then, you'd have the rest of the action, the barreled action would be in this pile. And then what would happen is, after the war, all those parts were rounded up, shipped back to Russia, where they were stuck in warehouses for several years. Then when these rifles started coming out of Russia, they were imported back into the United States. A lot of them were as surplus for the retail market. What would happen is they would go into the factories, they would take this barrel and that bolt and that stock, and they would just fit everything together. Then they would sit there with electric pencils and take the number that was on the receiver and what we would call force match. So they would write that number on the receiver, usually peen out all the numbers everywhere else and rewrite them or rescribe those numbers on every other part, making it force matched. So it wasn't the original stamping, it's this really crude looking scrolling and this ugly electric penciling. Then they were typically re-dipped or refinished, both the stock and all the other parts, and then shipped back to the United States where they were import marked. To make a long story as short as I can, you used to, even 5 years ago, those are called RCs or Russian captures. You could usually tell that it was a Russian capture with the big X stamped on the receiver, plus all the electric penciling, and the refinishing was a good indicator, and all the mismatched parts. Those used to be sold as fun operational shooters for the $200 to $300 range. Now those rifles are even creeping up to $500 or $600. Then you get into, usually you would have U.S. captured guns where, again, when they were captured, they'd say, take your bolt. Usually it's just the bolt was in this pile and the rest of the rifle was in that pile. And when they brought them back to the country, you usually always find the gun completely matching except for the bolt. Still is considered a mismatched gun, but because it was brought back as a war trophy, they usually didn't have the importation marks. They usually still have their original finish, unless it was called what is known as bubbud, where the colloquial term for the random garage gunsmith was known as bubba, where, remember, back in the day, these things were not very desirable, and you could pick them up at a hardware store for $20 or $10. And they would like to turn them into hunting rifles. They would sporterize the stocks and refinish them. You'd usually see they would practice their engraving skills on the receivers and stuff, or rechamber them. Those sorts of things that have not been bubbud but are original complete rifles, and that would be like this one, except for a couple mismatched parts, usually the bolt. Usually you used to find those in the $600 to $700 range. Now those are going up to $1,000 or $1,200. Then you have what most collectors want are the complete original and matching rifles, where they are 100% original finish, 100% all matching parts, haven't been bubbud or toyed with, haven't been sporterized, everything on its original. And remember, you can tell because the Germans are very, very keen on serializing every single part on the gun. Even the action screws down here would be serialized until about the end of the war, where you got into the Craig's models where they were rush production, and you'd find just serialized parts on the main parts, and those are actually pretty collectible in and of themselves. But I digress. Anyway, like I said, you could write a book on all of this, and I'm trying to be as brief as I can. But those all matching, all correct, and all original guns with original finish. Nowadays, even if it's a BYF, which is Mauser, which would be most common, even those are starting at $2,000. So if you want a nice original that, non-Russian captured like this, mismatched parts, and this particular one has been sanded and refinished, and the action has been refinished, but all the parts actually on this one are all matching except for the band springs up here. you know, $600, which isn't terrible. Again, unfortunately, 5 years ago, this would probably be worth $300, $400. Or you can get into a Russian capture gun maybe for $400, $500 if you can find one, but at least, you know, can complete out that part of your collection if you just want an example as a shooter with original German parts, just all force matched and refinished. Enfields are another one. A ton of these have come into the country. The number 1 Mark IIIs that we looked at and the number 4 Mark Is like this, usually you find them everywhere. They were huge amounts of these things were built, and a lot of them were imported into the country, so you will find most of them with importation marks, unfortunately. Used to be something like this in good matching condition would go for $200 to $300, you know, just 5 or 6 years ago. Now I'm seeing them, if they're all matching with import marks, going for up to $500 or $600. Some more rare examples, you know, are going up to $700, $800, $900, and if you can find them without importation marks, maybe up over $1,000, just because that's uncommon. Most of them were import marked. So remember, if a firearm is being imported into the country by an importer, that they're going to resell them, like PW Arms or Century or, you know, R Guns or anybody like that, they're required by law to import mark them, and they have been required by law for quite some time that they have to import mark the firearm, and essentially the firearm becomes logged as a new gun. The importer will put their information on it, their address, a new serial number, and they'll typically put the caliber on it. So if a dealer like myself logs in the gun, we log it in under the importation information, not the original, you know, like this, which is import marked. We wouldn't say, you know, Fazerk Lee is the manufacturer, and then, you know, with the original serial number, we'll reference all the information on the importation mark. You're going to mainly find, if it's going to be without an importation mark, it likely came into the country as a bring back or a war trophy from a previous conflict. That's why you can find K98 Mausers pretty commonly without importation marks. You can find Japanese Arisakas without importation marks. You can find M1 Garands without importation marks because a lot of the times they were, you know, brought back into the country, they were U.S. firearms. Since the U.S. was not in a conflict with Russia, you're typically not going to find SVT-40s or SKSs without importation marks on them because no soldier would have brought it back from a conflict. There are some limited circumstances, and I did actually used to own an SVT-40 with no importation marks on it. You can assume maybe when Russia and the USA met up in Berlin after the war, maybe U.S. soldiers saw an SVT-40 laying around and thought it would be cool to take home, so they threw it in their duffel bag, but that's a pretty rare circumstance. Same with Enfields. You know, we weren't in a conflict with England, therefore Enfields were not brought back home after the war as war trophies because we didn't fight in conflicts with the British. Again, you can find them without importation marks because there were some cases where they were probably brought home, or they found their way into the country through another avenue. Maybe somebody smuggled them in, I don't know. Or they were shipped home in parts. Again, you can only speculate, but they weren't brought in. The Enfields and the Mosin Nagants were not brought into the country in mass numbers without importation marks on them. But anyway, that's why if you can find these without importation marks, or 1895 Nagant revolvers, or like I said, the SVT-40s or SKSs, if you can find those without importation marks, they usually will demand a premium because they are very few and far between. That's all the time we have for you today on these. Thanks again so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider hitting that thumbs up button and subscribing to our channel. We do a whole bunch of other World War II and surplus type content, so go check out our older videos for those. If you have any other questions, leave those down in the comments section. I get to as many of those as I can to try to answer those for you guys. Again, this is Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. We will see you next time.